England, and after teaching at university and in school, she now combines her research and writing on classics with freelance tutoring. She also keeps a classics blog and creates classics memes on Instagram. She holds a doctorate from the University of Oxford in ancient history, and her thesis focused on the Greek historian Polybius. She maintains a keen interest in ancient political theory and its applicability to the 21st century, about which she will be speaking today in her paper entitled "The People and the Politeia, Good Government and a Willing Populace in Ancient Greek Political Theory." And the floor is now yours, George.
Thank you very much, John, for that very kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here again today and to be sharing my humble offering on the ancient world with you all. So I'm just going to share my screen now. So you can all see my presentation. Okay, here we go. Okay. Okay, so title slightly different on the presentation, but the theme is basically the same. Popular power and the Politeia, the ever-present political force, namely the people. So, who has the power? Well, here are my thoughts on the subject. With revolution now decided upon by the men, and with the anger of the women arising in every household, and doubled, their hatred burned. As soon as night came, the whole city filled with noise and torches and hurrying back and forth. And now the spaces around the palace and the stadium and the street were all filled with the mob of every form, as was the area in front of the theatre of Dionysus. And at that very moment, the masses assembled from every part of the city, so that not only were the places and their grounds full to the brim with people, but also the steps and the roofs all mingled with screaming and shouting rising up. No, this is not the French Revolution, although one would be certainly forgiven for thinking this comes out of Victor Hugo. But this is in fact the Greek historian Polybius. He is describing the end of the corrupt, violent, and ruthlessly ambitious, power-grabbing Agathocles. He was not king of Egypt, but advisor to the very young king who was yet to come of age. Agathocles had exploited his position, and unable to bear the state of affairs any longer, the mob rose up and killed him, the crowd led by the soldiers who willingly joined them. A few sections later, Polybius makes the following observation. For the savagery of the people of Egypt when their passions take over is truly terrible. The people have torn even the women of Agathocles' family from the temple, and they meet a savage end as well. Now, out of context, Polybius appears to be condemning the revolution, and he certainly does disapprove of the level to which the violence has escalated. However, the concept of a people turning on a corrupt, self-serving ruler who governs at the expense of their needs to line his own pockets and power, he does not see as unjustifiable. When describing Agathocles' actions following his appointment alongside Xanthippus to be the young king's guardian, Polybius shows a developing tyrant in Agathocles. Agathocles surrounded himself with men whom he pays to create a loyal ring of guards and aggressively monopolized power. The Egyptian people, already worried by the conduct of their previous king, only grew in resentment and anger. The grim episode is a very close parallel for Polybius's theoretical portrayal of the overthrow of the tyrant in Book 6. Book 6 forms his account of the strengths of the Roman mixed Politeia, which he prefaces with an account of how the single types arise and decline. The single types being whether the one, the few, or the many are in charge without any mixing between types. What he says is this: but when they have received power from family succession, and they already had everything prepared for their safety, for more that was sufficient for their nourishment too, they then yielded to their desires because of the abundance. Jealousy and resentment arise among the people, and a courageous group of men champion their cause and overthrow the tyranny because they have perceived the discontent of the people. So when government ceases to be in the interest of the people and the common good, at least in Polybius's portrayal so far, a politeia ceases to be a good type and changes into its bad, degraded equivalent. The people's reaction to and perceptions of their leader or leaders can be integral to judging the nature of that politeia. This does obviously not mean that the people themselves cannot show a sense of power, loving, ambition, or grasping actions. However, when a ruler or ruling element, is patently deficient in the execution of their duty, often executing their citizens instead, as Agathocles did, their overthrow emanating from those they rule is not necessarily considered to be unjustified. And Polybius, as I will show you in this talk, is not atypical of Greek authors in this aspect. That a ruler or rulers had a duty to the people and their contentment was a core feature of Greek political theory. Consensus did not have to be institutionalized through an assembly that voted and elected to be important in maintaining a healthy politeia. So what I should like to argue in this paper, in keeping with this year's conference's theme of leaders and the led, is to suggest that the people, however contemptuous many Greek authors might have been towards the masses in reality, were not just in theory viewed as an important and validating force within a political community, which inevitably meant that they were perceived as a source of power that cannot be ignored. At least they should be. But before I explore how the notion of the people's consensus and common good came to define the development of the distinctions between good and bad politeia, I shall first briefly examine the term politeia itself that I've been using in these last few minutes. It is not an easy term to translate into English, and constitution, which, though a very common translation, is merely a convenient one and does not do justice to this rich and complex term. The main sections of my talk will be the term politeia and how the good versus the bad types evolved and how they were distinguished, how a leader or leaders should conduct him or themselves to maintain their support and encourage true consensus. But I also want to look at the power of the people in terms of how they also can be motivated by self-interest, how self-interested leaders can play on this and stir it up, and how they can also be stirred to unjustified anger against their leaders, and the potentially very damaging consequences of this response. Historical examples of the positive of power of the people in overthrowing bad regimes, as well as the more negative instances of the exercise of popular power, will be considered towards the end. It's important to say that whilst the honourable it's all for the good of the people sentiments were not always a reality in Greek cities, certainly were not, the actual notion that they could overthrow a degraded and deteriorated regime was not a purely theoretical musing. So first, politeia. Politeia inevitably is related to the Greek word polis, meaning city, and thus literally means the form of the city. It was defined and classified principally according to the composition of the ruling element, but this belies the greater complexity that the term encompasses. It is not just about the number of people in charge and what the government looked like in terms institutionally. The term for that was in fact politeiuma, but the term politeia is also a dynamic one. It covered the daily conduct of the citizens as well, the practices that shape their lives, not just the conduct of the ruling element, and how these practices also shape the relationship between ruler and ruled. The term can also mean citizenship, which, depending on type of politeia, covered a range of rights and levels of participation across the Greek world. Paul Cartledge noted in his book, Greek Political Thought in Practice, politeia thus came to denote both actively participatory citizenship and the polis's very life and soul. In short, the functioning of the community maybe is principally defined by the ruling element and what that looked like, but certainly not that was certainly not all it was about. Compare the following statement by 4th century BC politician, theorist and orator Isocrates. Every politeia is the soul of the state, having as much power over it as the mind over the body. The form of the politeia also defined the nature and dynamics of the relations between ruler and ruled, as I've already touched upon, as well as the differing groups within the society itself. Sometimes these groups were in harmony, sometimes they came into conflict. Polybius depicts a politeia as a dynamic equilibrium, which he denotes with the term antiploia, for which there is no straightforward translation. What it means is a ship held in place by conflicting winds on its sails, sometimes keeping it steady, sometimes tipping it over too far one way, hopefully then righted by the conflicting wind, or perhaps sunk completely. When describing Lycurgus's careful arrangement of the Spartan mixed politeia to achieve lasting stability, Polybius writes, but he did so in order that, by being accurately adjusted and in exact equilibrium, long remained steady, kept upright as a ship by the conflicting breezes. So a politeia is therefore characterized by conduct and action as much as by institutions, and it is the former that form the important criteria for moral judgment, whether it's a good or bad type. A striking example of this dynamic aspect comes from 4th century orator and political theorist Isocrates. The Athenian politeia might have been fairly classed as a democracy in the 5th and 4th centuries BC, but they were not, Isocrates tells us, the same politeia. His explanation of this judgment is that the conduct that made the earlier democracy praiseworthy, the conduct of the people in governing Athens, was no longer the same. Their conduct had changed, and this meant that it was not the same politeia. It was not the same democracy. A similar sentiment is reflected in his later work, the Areopagiticus. It was the spirit of the politeia, he says, that defined it, namely the conduct of the ruling element and the willing support of the people who deemed them worthy of power. It was not always easy to determine whether a politeia was a good or bad type, however. It might look like a good type in terms of its institutions, but might function like a defective or a bad type. This Polybius recognized, and so did Aristotle. Therefore, to determine which it was, one had to look at how the ruling element conducted itself, how they were perceived by those they ruled, and therefore whether the politeia functioned well as a whole. A politeia is not defined solely by numbers. Okay, and here I have attempted to put to a sort of chart the evolution of the different terms for the simple types of politeia from Herodotus down to Polybius. And we will talk a little bit about the criteria on which they were distinguished. So we start off with the 3 simple types. And we have moved by Polybius's time to 6 simple types, all with different labels. So let us have a look at what the criteria were to distinguish them. Now we start with Herodotus in his passage on a debate that apparently happened between 3 Persian rebels about whether the Persian Empire should become a democracy, remain a tyranny, or become an oligarchy. He lists only 3 types by names, but each speaker highlights the advantages and the pitfalls with the regimes he discusses. So they all can be good and bad. Tyrannos, as you see, appears twice in the box for Herodotus on the power of the one. Tyrannos was not always a pejorative term. It simply denoted an absolute ruler, but it did not necessarily denote a bad ruler. But gradually, as time comes on, tyranny becomes a critical and pejorative term. So in Herodotus, we have tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy, although he doesn't explicitly use the word democracy. In the Republic, we have a rather unusual division of types. It's Plato, of course we do. There were basically one good type for Plato, and that was the politeia based on perfect knowledge. And this can either be a kingship or an aristocracy, kingship being basileia, aristocracy being aristokratia. They are both the one good type. He doesn't actually distinguish between them as different types. All the other types are bad. Tyranny, oligarchy, timocracy, and democracy. Oligarchy is where a few self-serving leaders are empowered to democracy, where wealth has become a qualification and ambition has taken over, to somewhat oversimplify his detailed discussion in book 8. As we move a bit later, we move to Xenophon, who in his work, The Memorabilia, recounts his conversations with Socrates. And in a conversation he purports to have had with Socrates, 6 types are distinguished, although democracy has 2 types within the same term. So kingship is good, rule of the one, tyranny the bad, aristocracy good, plutocracy. Now here the distinction is less on whether they are self-serving or greedy than that wealth is the eligibility criteria for them to be leaders. However, it still has the same flavour of thought in that these men are not going to have the same dedication to the common good if it's based on wealth and they are rated for their wealth rather than rated for their just conduct. And democracy has good and bad variants. Aristotle is the first, we think, to give 6 labels to each type. Again, we have kingship and tyranny as the good and bad rule of the one. Aristocracy and oligarchy are the good and bad rule of the few. Now, this is an interesting one. The many, the good form is politeia. You think, well, hang on, that means the organization of the city, yet he's using it as a single type. I haven't got the time to discuss what I think that means. If anyone would like to ask me about that at the end, I do have some thoughts on that and I'd love to discuss it. Democracy is the bad type of the rule of the many for Aristotle. And like Plato, he also discusses the mixed politeia, many types here. And finally, we come to Polybius, who is basically the same as Aristotle, except democracy has become the good rule of the many, and ochlocracy, the bad rule of the many, which is mob rule. And Polybius favoured a mixed politeia. Rome is the great example. Carthage and Sparta are also good, but have long past their prime. So we can see in all of what we see in all of these is, broadly speaking, the good politeia rule not because of any material qualification or criteria, but the goods all rule because they are ruling in the interest of their citizens. The bad, sometimes it's the eligibility that's not purely based on how well they conduct themselves, or it's that they're ruling in their own interest. And Aristotle and Polybius broadly agree on the fact that it's ruling in the interest of the people equals good, ruling in the interest of themselves on the part of the rulers equals bad. So very much it's about the people, has got the people always in the background, that they are the ones whom the politeia should serve. So how do leaders conduct themselves if they are going to prove their dedication to the people and not get overthrown? So we can move now to look at how the dynamic should be functioning in a good politeia. As we shall see, it's one of constant negotiation and careful action. So, is the leader protected by his citizens, or is he protected from his citizens? This issue is nowhere better stated than Aristotle, who encapsulates it very neatly in the following quotation. And the politeia is not tyrannical for this reason. Talking about the rule of one here. For citizens guard their kings with weapons, but a foreign guard protects tyrants. For the former, the kings rule according to the law over willing subjects, and the latter over unwilling subjects. And so the former receive their protection by their citizens, and the latter against their citizens. So how is the role of the good leader or leaders envisaged? How does he ensure that he is protected from willing loyalty and does not have to buy it in? Aristotle notes a politeia is composed of its people, and the nature of the relationship between ruler and ruled is a dynamic of reciprocity. The ruler takes care of their needs and the people must in turn show their loyalty. Plato similarly noted that true loyalty was to be earned from the citizens by ensuring their needs were met, rather than leaving them to struggle. In Book 5 of the Republic, he argues that citizens can only be happy when they are freed from sufferings and struggles for life's necessities. This is essential to a healthy, functioning politeia and good leadership. So he says, from all these, then, they will finally be free and will live a happier life than the ones men count most happy, the life of victors at Olympia. How so? The things for which those, i.e. the victors of Olympia, are made happy are a small part of what is secured for these. Their victory is fairer and their public support more complete. So leaders who take care of their citizens' needs and ensure that they have the nourishment and the necessities they require receive a much greater happiness in the loyalty of their citizens, and the citizens have their needs met. This is far more important than someone who has won Olympic victory. In this, he implies those who think victors are happiest are somewhat missing the mark. Aristotle also refers to the need for people to perceive their safety as cared for by their leaders. The theme is further picked up by Polybius, quite possibly influenced by Plato and Aristotle, in Book 6. The good king and the aristocrats are willingly supported by their citizens, and also importantly, do not make any form of visible distinction in their conduct between themselves and their subjects. The meeting of one's citizens' needs was the prime duty of the ruling element. Now, this may all seem very nice and theoretical and a bit living on cloud nine, but actually, I think the pandemic has offered us a nice parallel here, and to some extent borne this out. The clear expectations that were laid at the door of governments for support as the pandemic forced businesses to close, or at least come to a halt in the wake of lockdown, how measures to stop panic buying were angrily demanded. Objections were levelled against measures aimed at inhibiting the spread of the virus, some arguing that these were unfair, either because they are excessive or because they are insufficient. Either way, we've got governments called upon to exercise their duty and help their citizens out. Leaders were and, well, are in the spotlight, and perhaps more fittingly, they're in the dock. So the second theme, therefore, is the need for the leader or leaders to conduct themselves carefully in their public actions. They need to be seen as just and genuine, rather inclined to self-aggrandizement. Polybius states that this lies in their not distinguishing themselves from their people in either their taste or consumption of foods and use of dress. They were free from critical slanders and envy because they did not create great distinctions either in their dress or their food or drink, but maintained a way of life very similar to the rest, and always engaged in a daily routine like that of the masses. Aristotle follows a similar line of reasoning, arguing that good conduct encourages consensus and willing support. When leaders are not perceived to be abiding by their own laws or enriching themselves, when many others are suffering, support dwindles, as one could see the recent Partygates in the UK as an example. So perceived inconsistency on the conduct of the leader or ruling element quickly causes resentment, and understandably. Above all, a leader must be seen to be fair in their administration of justice and in the assignment of honour and punishment. This issue appears in most Greek authors on the theme of politics and the good Politeia. Authors may differ in their views on the purpose, nature, and extent of punishment, but all agree that they should not be governed by personal favour and support seeking. A politeia cannot be good if leaders are seen visibly to target their enemies when it comes to punishment and to reward friends when it comes to assigning honours for their own personal gain or loyalty buying, for example, removing any fear of prosecution and getting friends out of the soup. Polybius, describing the essential role left for the people in maintaining the capital courts at Rome, says that no politeia can be healthy when justice is not fairly administered and no distinction maintained between right and wrong.
All right, George, I think we'll have to wrap it up there.
That's okay. I'm nearly done actually, so that's okay.
Okay,
that's
wonderful.
Fine. Okay, I'm just going to say, so to come to the last section on mutual self-interest, which I will shorten a little bit because I realise we are running short of time. Polybius talks in 657 about the problem of the rivalry for office and how the people, out of resentment, turn to their own self-interest and how this is taken advantage of by leaders in such states. And I think we've all seen examples of this recently, again, looking back at Partygates and MPs' expenses scandals. At the other extreme, Xenophon says as follows: the number cried out that it was a terrible thing if someone did not allow the people to do whatever it wished. So what have we seen? Who has the power? Well, both do. But the people never go away, even when it's a minority government formally in charge. They cannot afford to ignore the will of the people. The people will make their voice heard even if the belief is not being listened to. Even when they might be seen passive, they're always there as a source of power. Thank you.
All right, great. Everyone, I'm sure, is giving you a virtual round of applause from across the screen. And thank you so much for this presentation on Greek political theory. I think we'll have enough time maybe for one question. And I'm not currently seeing any on our partner channels, so I will use my chair's prerogative to ask a question of my own. So one thing that I noted, George, is that all of these authors are from among who we would consider elites, right? Yeah, these are all wealthy men who probably turned their noses up at the kind of masses generally, with exceptions, I'm sure. So I'm wondering what you might think of, as far as theory goes, considering how the practice might actually be. And I'm thinking specifically of, ancient Athenian demos, right?
Yeah.
No, the elites were not in charge there, but they had their own ideas. So go ahead.
Absolutely. No, good point. And you're right. They were from the elite, and people, I didn't get a chance to bring him in. It would have made the presentation far too long, but Cicero was particularly contemptuous of the masses, and Polybius to some extent too, actually. But I think even if their expression of the duty of care perhaps is more theoretical, I think certainly they did take a dim view of elites who were self-enriching. And you do see that played out in practice. So thank you very much for asking that. The best example I could find is the overthrow of the 400. Yes. Which after the Sicilian expedition went horribly wrong. Of course, everyone's terrified, so some self-interested individuals start putting noise about that it's all to do with democracy's fault. Democracy is terrible, it's not working. So, and by a rather complex game of divide and rule and fostering of suspicion, the 400 managed to get the democracy to vote itself away. Now, this doesn't last very long, fortunately, but it's a pretty aggressive regime, and it's the people who overthrow it. And even Thucydides, who's no fan of Athenian democracy post Pericles, certainly is not pro the 400. He's absolutely behind the overthrow of this regime. And it was eventually, when the fleet returned from Samos to the Piraeus, that started the ball rolling. So the people, admittedly with leaders, but people who are pro the democracy do overthrow this horrible 400 group. So it did happen in practice that the people overthrew these regimes and were seen as justified in their actions. So it was not a completely theoretical vacuum, even if it was dressed up rather nicely, and it all sounds lovely on paper, and their attitudes weren't quite so friendly in reality, but it was something they saw, and it was something they did recognize as valid, that if a regime was corrupt, if it was aggressive, people overthrew it. The overthrow of the 400 is not disapproved of.
Great, thank you. Yes, yeah. Thank you. And we have one question from a viewer on YouTube. CS Thai Guy asks, you had mentioned the problem of perfect knowledge as one of the potential issues with democracy. Do you have any ideas on how political structure would actually impact the availability or consumption of this knowledge?
Right. Well, perfect knowledge is certainly Plato's issue, and he never, ever, I don't think in the Republic, he really ever defines what this would be, or how he talks about always going towards it, and that people to some extent are excluded. They just have to sort of do as they're told. But how one might do this in reality, I think in the modern world, we very much have to think about the diversity question, rethinking how we transmit knowledge in schools, transmit knowledge on social media, to create a more inclusive feeling. Because I think as we see different movements nowadays, and people who don't feel included, who do feel disgruntled, then one needs to say, well, why are we not bringing these people online? So I don't think perfect knowledge is ever possible, but I think and we could be here a long time if we debate the nature of knowledge, which is cool fun. But I think rather than say it's perfect knowledge, then a constant sort of a rethinking about how we frame education, about how we frame public discourse, because it's much more accessible than it was. You know, it's much more, people can participate on social media, on on the internet as well, obviously, and therefore it's not just the accessibility you have to think, it's the what is the how that's used to stop, especially in a democratic setting, to say, well, everyone's part of this, everyone has a stake in it, and not come across as exclusive in its sort of outlook and outreach, so to speak. So sorry, I hope that answers your question. It's a really good question. Thank you very much for that.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. And thank you, George, for this awesome presentation. And I'm going to turn it over now to David Danzig, who has a brief announcement.